We have all watched the tragedy unfold in Ukraine, and there is so much talk about it on the news. However, so much of that information is confusing or incorrect. So today, we're going to dig into the origins of this conflict and look into how it could end. So stay tuned. Before we get started, I just want to take a minute and ask a favor. Please think about subscribing because that helps the channel a ton. Hey everybody, this is Chris Brandt here with Sandesh Patel. Welcome to another future video podcast. Today, we are having back friend of the podcast, the amazing Lindsey Alexander, or as she is known on social media, Disinfo Gal. Lindsey is former FBI and CIA, where she specialized in Russia and the near abroad. She speaks multiple languages and is well-versed in the history of this region. Lindsey has been producing an absolute ton of content on her TikTok channel, and her TikTok lives are a great source of information on what is happening. Now, we're not going to be able to cover every detail on this podcast, so I would encourage everyone to check out her TikTok channel to get a deeper understanding. Now, there's a lot to cover, so let's get started. Welcome, Lindsey.
Thank you, and thank you for having me again. I appreciate it. Love being here.
I'm so excited. I mean, both Sandesh and I have been talking about how excited we are to have this conversation because I think this is going to be super cool because, you know, like I said, I think there's just an enormous amount of confusion about what is happening, what the history is. I mean, you know, like I even saw like, you know, Candace Owens, you know, like railing on the news about how Russia invented Ukraine, you know, and, you know, it just some things are just bizarre, the news that's out there. And I think that's a great point to start, you know, like, can you know the history of the region. Can you just give us like a real brief history of Ukraine?
Yes, and I'll start with Russia did not invent Ukraine, just to clarify for people. I know Putin himself has said that, and that actually comes from more of an imperial Russia concept from the 1800s, that kind of how we saw Russia behave during that time. But for Ukraine, they have been relatively a country for the most of their existence, especially since medieval times. And what most people don't recognize is that, like, going from medieval times to most of the 1600s, like near the end of the 1600s, they really had no connection to Russia. There was no linguistical connection, no cultural, no religious, political. There was a clear separation between those two entities and those two kind of empires. And like many countries in Eastern Europe, including Russia itself, there's very complicated histories, and there's, shared rulings of different parts. I know, like, Poland's been split up many times, and Ukraine has too. And so through like the 16, 17, and 1800s, it kind of was partitioned and ruled by the Poles, the Lithuanians at one time, the Austrians, and then a little bit by the Russians. And that's where you'll get the comments you see Putin making now about, Ukraine. But Ukraine, as we know it today, has been kind of geographically where it's been before Russia got into there. And the reason Russia actually ended up, ruling portions of it starting in the late 1700s was because, the Ukrainian Cossacks themselves were tired of Polish rule, and they were tired of the Poles ruling their portion of Ukraine, and the Lithuanians and the Austrians. So they actually then reached out to the Russians to get assistance in gaining their independence.
Be careful what you ask for, huh?
Right, exactly. And they did that. And as we've seen in history, the Russians, they did quickly gain their independence. There's a lot of turmoil. But then the Russians did start to slowly rule over parts of Ukraine and institute more Russian ideologies and language, and kind of expanding that there. I can go into more of the history, but it very much was a country, kind of before the Soviet Union, and before now, and it has changed a bit under the Soviet Union as well. But that's kind of like the gist of that aspect of it. Yeah.
There's been some even talk about Russian, Ukraine descended from Russian language, but it actually appears it's the other way around, that Russian language actually descended from the sort of proto Ukrainian languages. And which I think is also an interesting thing because of the sort of Russian rule. Another kind of interesting quirk about Ukraine is that almost all Ukrainians speak Russian, but not all Russians speak Ukrainian. And I know that's one of the big ways that they're sort of distinguishing who's who on the battlefield. But
one of the reasons, actually, because of that language situation that they have there, is because like during the Russian rule, specifically actually when the USSR was formed and under Stalin, he did a lot of purging and ethnic cleansing, unfortunately, in that region, targeting the Ukrainians. That included the language, because to them, and this is the case with many countries throughout the world, language is tied to the identity. And for Ukrainians, their language is made up of their history, of their culture. It's made up of, there's significant Polish influence on their language. There's Lithuanian influence. There's Hungarian influence. There's a lot of different influences there. And, because there's that Russian nexus that came later, there's that slight influence as well. But it's not the same as that Russian ability. And so when during the Soviet times, the Ukrainian language was pushed out because that was an effort to control the region more by putting in the Russian language and instilling that, and using forceful measures to those that would speak Ukrainian, would read Ukrainian books, listen to Ukrainian music. Like they would be shot and killed in the street and things like that. And we're seeing that, now too, unfortunately.
And like I said, if people want more information, they should go check out your TikToks, because you've covered just about everything at this point. So, then let's step into the USSR period, right? Because, I mean, that was a troubled relationship in an enormous way. I mean, there was yet another Holocaust in Ukraine, too. I mean, could you talk about, what it was like under the USSR?
In a nutshell, it was horrendous, in my opinion. And this was my academic specialty, is this area and time period. So definitely let me know if I overtalk. After the Bolshevik Revolution, from 1918 to 1921, Ukraine did gain some small independence. And then during the time that the USSR was formed, it was given what they call autonomy, but it really wasn't any type of sovereignty or anything like that. And it kind of had that independence for a very, very brief time, for about 10 years, before Stalin started to engage more in the ethnic cleansing of the region. And that included key areas that he wanted to eventually overtake, have Russia overtake, which is Crimea, the Donbass region in the eastern Ukraine. And with that ethnic cleansing, he, purged the areas, either deported, Bulgarians, the Tatars. I always actually mispronounce that, but the Tatar region was actually right near Crimea. He deported them to Siberia and other parts of Central Asia, but he just deported and cleansed certain areas, and that also included conducting a starvation method that resulted in the death of over 4 million Ukrainians, which is it's terrible. There aren't words to describe that. And he did that, and once he kind of did that cleansing, he imported, for lack of a better term, Russians and put them in those regions as well. So he could say that Russians are in those regions, therefore they're mine. And that's a lot of what we're seeing occur today, and why we see the reference from Putin many times of that historic connection. It was actually because of Stalin instituting those elements to gain that control in that region.
So then after the fall of the Soviet Union, how did, in the balkanization of all that that region, how did the Ukraine Russia relationship change at that point?
So, like many of the other Soviet states that separated, it became more, or was supposed to become more of a like military financial partnership, because during the Soviet Union time, and I should have mentioned this before, the Kremlin decided to find ways to make all the Soviet states relying on them almost solely for their politics, their economies, everything. And because of that, it was harder for some Soviet states to really separate themselves post, the fall of the Soviet Union. But with Ukraine in the early 90s, just because of where it was positioned, it's, very diverse history. It did separate itself and want that autonomy and that sovereignty back. And with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 91, and then with the Budapest Memorandum in 94, which included Russia, the US, and the UK, it was given that sovereignty. And all countries involved recognized the borders of Ukraine. And there was that agreement there that Russia specifically was recognizing that the borders as it stood in 91 of Ukraine, or 94, sorry, were going to be its borders, and it would respect that. Obviously, that memorandum was violated many times, including in 2014 and now. But that was the initial agreement after the fall.
Well, and I think it's worth mentioning too that Ukraine is the biggest country in Europe outside of Russia, right? So it's not like it's a tiny little territory.
Yes, and it is abundant in natural resources. Like it is, they call it the breadbasket of Europe for a reason. Like it provides a lot of resources, and it's a thorough way to the Middle East because of the Black Sea. It has great access, and that's one of the reasons it's hotly contested. And
the one thing I just want to also mention, because I hear this debate all the time and people just really don't understand this concept, and sometimes I catch myself doing it too, but can you explain the difference between Ukraine and the Ukraine?
Ukraine, as Ukrainians like to call their country, they don't use the Ukraine because that was a Soviet reference to their country. So that's how the Kremlin and kind of the oppressor, as they view it, viewed their country. And so it's offensive, essentially, if you use that. Same with mispronunciations of certain towns and cities throughout Ukraine. I know the West predominantly was pronouncing certain cities in the Russian vernacular when it should be pronounced in the Ukrainian.
The biggest one you're referencing is Kyiv, which is traditionally pronounced Kiev in Russian. When America, Ukraine was in the American conscious originally, it was through Russia or through the USSR, as part of a big missile base of Russian weapons, in general. I mean, and I think, when at the fall of the Soviet Union, and when Ukraine became a separate nation, they were the third largest nuclear power on the planet at that time, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like you said, they were a major nuclear power. They had ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles, and other nuclear elements. However, with the Budapest Memorandum in 94, like I mentioned, it contained signatures from US, UK, and Russia, not only recognizing the border of Ukraine, but also agreeing that Ukraine would be protected if it gives up its nuclear capabilities, and it did, knowing that essentially none of those countries would invade it. It would be relatively protected, and those countries would come to the aid of Ukraine should Ukraine need it.
And, as much as I imagine they probably would like to have those nuclear weapons back right now, I would imagine that had they not given up those nuclear weapons, there would have been substantially more problems for them over the years. So I would imagine that kind of kept things at bay for a long period of time, right?
I think so.
Then let's get into sort of like the origins of this current conflict. And when we, you mentioned, the sort of the activities in 2014, and that's, obviously when Russia rolled in and took over Crimea and, occupied, portions of eastern Ukraine, the Donbas region there.
So one of the, I guess, historical reasons for Putin wanting to, and it's important to note, Putin wanting Crimea under Russia control is because, that area has historically been very strategic, and it's important not only because of military access and capabilities it allows, but the control over shipping lanes and naval lanes in the Black Sea, as well as access, to NATO areas in other parts of the world. And historically, Crimea has kind of been, contested between Ukraine and Russia for nearly the entire 1800s. Into the early 1900s, Crimea became under Russian control. Before then, though, it was Ukrainian, it was Polish, it's kind of been under everybody's control. And Putin, wants it back, along with the eastern part of Ukraine, just because of the strategic importance it had during the Imperial Russia time frame. And he really wants to not only rebuild Russia to that reputation, but also have certain elements of that empire that was seen under the Soviet Union back as well. And by having those key areas, he controls a lot of economic structures and military structures regionally. And that gives, Russia more power in the region and Ukraine less power just because of the strategic location of those areas.
Crimea is, was where the Russian Black Sea Fleet was too, right? Mm-hmm. And I mean, so that was, for them, that had a lot of military impact when they lost that region. So I got to imagine, that was one of their incentives. And they keep pointing, there's a lot of confusion about Crimea, I think, too, because there's a big Russian population, obviously, in Crimea. There's also a big Ukrainian population in Crimea. And as I understand Crimea, people from the Crimean region generally think of themselves as Crimean first, and then whether Ukrainian or Russian second. So I think that sort of kind of muddies the waters a little bit, and when people talk about that region.
It does, yes, because and we run into that issue in eastern Ukraine as well, because people will identify differently depending not just on their ethnicity or their language, but just because of kind of how they see themselves. But it is important to note there's been multiple polls done in those regions that show even though there are Russian ethnicities, they don't necessarily feel that strong tie to be part of Russia. Yeah. And I think that gets overlooked as well. But I will add, there is the historical element with Crimea is really important to Ukraine and Russia for different reasons. Russia wants that control and power back, and it views Crimea as part of them because of the ethnic cleansing that occurred in that region to make it have more Russians there. Yeah. It didn't have that, and that's where Ukraine wants those regions back because historically there weren't Russians there. It wasn't until that cleansing unfortunately occurred, and so because of that history, that's kind of where the friction is now.
I want to kind of loop back to something you did mention. You said like Putin wants to restore Russia to not just the Soviet empire, but the Tsarist empire, right? I mean, which is obviously a much broader objective, right?
Yes, and he's very much focused on kind of the reputation he's going to leave behind and kind of his role in the world, and he's very empire focused and very much big picture in that regard, and wants to have that control that we saw not just in the USSR but with the Tsarist regimes that we previously saw in Russian history.
You're kind of touching on some of Russia's objectives. I think I don't think it's gone well for Putin's vision of what he was trying to achieve. Because I mean, when they kind of had this standoff for 8 years in the Donbas region, and so we all had this impression of, sort of this, Soviet might and, what would happen. And, Kyiv was going to fall in, 24 hours, 48 hours or what it was supposed to be, because this is the second most powerful army on the face of the earth. And they're just going to kind of roll in and just undo everything. And that went horribly wrong for them.
There were kind of many failures on the part of Russia in this, and they grossly underestimated their own the Ukrainians' ability. They underestimated the Ukrainian military and the leadership. And with Zelensky in particular, when he took office, many people, including many Ukrainians, underestimated his leadership capabilities.
Yeah.
Many Western countries did. And it was really a shock to the world, not just Russia, of how steadfast Zelensky is and how much strength he's showing.
Yeah.
It's just crazy. But Putin also overestimated his own military capabilities, and then underestimated NATO and kind of what their response would be, because historically NATO kind of sits on the sidelines a little bit, and isn't that aggressive. And this time it was actually very aggressive in the sense that it did something it didn't do before. It showed Russia's hand immediately from the get-go. That was and it was very cohesive strategy. And it appeared very organized by NATO and Western countries, where they all kind of took turns in showing Russia's hand and just declassifying intelligence, essentially, and saying Russia's going to invade Ukraine and putting that in the press, and thereby getting more popular support and letting Russia's playbook just basically be out there for anyone to see. And historically, NATO hasn't been that organized before, and it hasn't. I hate to say that, but
yeah.
And they haven't really been so blunt in those methods. And I think that was something the Russians weren't expecting, and that caused their disinformation to be ineffective at the get-go. And a lot of other elements came into play that, caused that to also not work in their regard. Adding on the NATO response with providing weapons, unlike it had provided before, and weapons that most likely are ones that Russia didn't count on.
In NATO's defense, I think that is kind of what it was built for.
Yep, I agree. And that's the thing. I know it's a pet peeve of mine lately. A lot of people compare this to World War II, and it's so different.
Yeah.
And there's different mechanisms in place, including NATO being here. There's some ways you could compare it to World War II. Hopefully not the ineffectiveness of the West to respond to the atrocities that we're seeing, but it is a different situation.
One thing that I think is really fascinating, you said, is that, Putin overestimated his forces' capabilities. And I got to say, I've been absolutely shocked watching how this all has been going down. One, it's like they're literally rolling out World War II era munitions, which is bizarre to me, in 2022. But I think the other thing is that, and I don't know if this was because of the Winter Olympics and deals with China or whatever, but Russia really advanced into Ukraine at the absolute wrong time, because it was so wet, and they don't have an expeditionary force, clearly, right? And so this rolling columns of tanks were sort of their one way to get there. But if the fields are wet and you're going to get stuck in the mud, you got to stick to the road. So now all of a sudden you got these super vulnerable columns of tanks coming down roads in an era where there's all sorts of satellite imagery and drones and all sorts of, long range standoff capabilities and things like that. To me, it was just bizarre. Do you think, one, it's like, is that because, Russia has a substantially smaller economy than, most other Western nations, but they also have a much smaller military budget than, say, the United States, right? But it almost strikes me. I know that this is a kleptocracy. We're looking at in Russia. It strikes me that just a lot of the money that they thought probably was going to the military probably didn't make it there.
I know I've been doing a lot of thinking about this very thing, and one of the things that has been limitedly considered is the fact that Russia just came out of it's still in the Afghanistan situation and that war situation, and it sort of came out of and is still in the Syria conflict. And a lot of their resources have been spent in those areas, not to mention other areas of the world where the Russian military is present. And I think that underestimated and took a lot of the resources that they originally could have used better in Ukraine. And had they taken those resources, we might be seeing a different situation, or most likely would have seen a different situation in Ukraine. Because according to the public information, Putin estimated that it would take less than a week to actually take over Ukraine based on his capabilities. And I think he was thinking he had more resources than he originally did. Not to mention, I know a lot of people question the timing of that. And I think one of the reasons that it was decided to go then, because historically Putin likes to surprise people or do something that wouldn't otherwise be thought logical in certain mannerisms and ways. And that being one of them is invading at a time where isn't the best time to go necessarily into Ukraine, and people weren't expecting it. Because I know, in my circle, most people were expecting it right after the Olympics ended, and I think the West was preparing for that essentially too. And I think he was just trying to take people off guard, and that was still not effective because it didn't really take people off guard.
One of the other interesting aspects of it too is, you've got a conscript army coming from Russia battling, a civilian population, essentially, a military presence. I mean, if you look at, military, the numbers and the, of troops in Russia versus the number of troops in Ukraine, you can see kind of a, a little bit of an unfair advantage on Russia's behalf in that regard. But you also have to put into context, you're not just fighting the military, you're fighting 78-year-old grandmothers, who are, throwing Molotov cocktails at your tanks. I mean, you literally are fighting the millions of people in the country. So they're being met with overwhelming force too, right?
It is really like the David and Goliath effect, where there's that. They're underestimating the will of the people and the unity of the people.
Yeah.
And with that, build strength. And that's what we're seeing with the Ukrainian people now. They're not going to, history is not going to repeat itself in Ukraine. They're going to fight for their country. And they have the whole world, nearly the whole world, backing them up. And I think that's why we're seeing kind of what we're seeing. And it's both inspiring and heartbreaking just because of the whole situation. Yeah.
The Ukrainians have been really fascinating to watch because they're dealing with tremendous tragedy. I mean, if you look at Bucha and the wholesale slaughter going on in Mariupol and all that. I mean, it's just horrific. Yeah. But at the same time, you also have these crazy Ukrainian farmers, laughing it up and taking TikToks of themselves as they're towing tanks and missile systems away. I mean, and just laughing about it. And I mean, it's just such a weird scene.
I would argue this is one of our first international conflicts where we see it in real time.
Yeah.
Because Afghanistan, no one really saw that in real time. And Syria, same with that, unfortunately. And the same atrocities, I will say, that are occurring in Ukraine have happened in those countries too.
Oh, sure.
That's important to note. And but this one, you have, the Ukrainian people are walking around with their iPhones, and TikTok is changing the landscape for conflict. So it is interesting.
The West's main tool. So we've got the Ukrainians fighting back amazingly effective. And I'm sure they're getting a tremendous amount of intelligence from the West that's, really aiding it. And they're certainly getting a ton of, sophisticated weapons. But, the NATO countries' big gun has been sanctions. And can you talk about, how this time it's kind of different than other times Russia's been sanctioned?
Normally with sanctions, they tend not to be as aggressive. Like they're more like slaps on the wrist, if anything, or just like Band-Aids, and they don't really target specific individuals to the extent that we're seeing now. However, with these sanctions, it's targeting key areas of like the Russian economy and key individuals. So not just the individuals like harming, the government individuals, but their family and their friends and their their mistresses and kind of all of that. And sanctions haven't really, targeted those types of individuals before either. And because of that, it's caught, some people off guard, and it has, caused more, turmoil amongst like the oligarchs. But in addition to that, with some of these sanctions, they're targeting directly the Russian people and impacting, which is very key, is, impacting areas that the Russian people are going to need to, survive in certain manners or in certain aspects. Like PayPal and Venmo, like those types of peer-to-peer financial applications as well. And so that's causing many Russians to not get paid for their work, and it's having more of a direct impact. And those sanctions are directly impacting imports and exports and business operations, within Russia. And again, it's not just one country doing it, it is, all of NATO. Which is very different than, what we've seen previously. And because of that, that can extensively, cripple an economy. And we're slowly seeing that. And we're slowly seeing kind of what we saw under the Soviet times, where like Western businesses and whatnot are pulling out of Russia. And it's going to, like, with sanctions, they kind of take a long time. Or a significant amount of time to really show that impact. And so the longer they're in place, the harder it's going to be for the Russian people, and the more pressure the Russian people will put on, hopefully, the Kremlin to change.
The thing that was interesting about it is, like, first of all, I would have expected a larger outcry from the Russian people than what we've seen. But more importantly, I haven't really seen the oligarchs break ranks yet. I mean, is that kind of surprising to you?
Not really. Like normally they don't really do much, because most of them probably have moved some of their money already to offshore accounts. I mean, if you watch the news, you're seeing their yachts get pulled over and seized, which is kind of fun to watch. But what's gonna like happen there is, or what could hurt them there is more like their families getting sanctioned. Like there's reports of, their kids having issues in the West and things like that. And that will build the pressure on the oligarch side. And there are a few oligarchs that have come out and, put bounties on Putin's head and things like that. But you're not necessarily going to see the pressure from the oligarchs until you see it from the people themselves. And so, locally, once the people start really feeling the effects of the sanctions, which from talking with people like Natasha on TikTok and whatnot, hearing that those sanctions are slowly starting to impact people. It might take another 6 months to a year before we actually start seeing that, because it doesn't happen. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen fast. We might start seeing more of the Russian people actually recognize what's going on. But the Russian government has a good hold on the media internally and are really changing that narrative to kind of blame the West already for these things. So that's going to, play a role in how they react as well.
Natasha, the TikToker you speak of, she lives in St. Petersburg too. So I got to imagine that, being the big capital is going to, that it is going to be, take a longer time to really feel as much of the impact, right? One of the things that, we keep hearing from the Russians is that our army's there to get rid of Nazis, and everybody's Nazis, and then it's Poland's Nazis, and then it's like Godwin's law is just exploding all over this. In one regard, like Nazi, being called a Nazi is like the worst thing you can call somebody, so there's that aspect of it. But I think in Russia, it's even more significant because their history with World War II. And, one thing we have to really consider is, while, all the Western alliances were all in the war too, Russia really bore a heavy burden during World War II, right? I mean, they lost a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Especially with the older Russians, because they either were around during that time or they would hear the stories from their parents. It is a semi-effective narrative for Russia, just because, especially with Putin, that has been one of their major enemies historically. And when, Putin wants to go back to the imperial and USSR type of, Russia, that was who they were going against for the longest time. Right. And so it brings back that whole concept and kind of, brings people back to that similar mindset that the Russians had during World War II and, fighting the Nazis. It is a bit ironic considering, Russia has one of the largest populations of neo-Nazis.
And they brought in neo-Nazis to come and help them fight the war.
Right, they did. And in Ukraine, there are neo-Nazis is an issue in Eastern Europe and throughout Europe, as well as in the United States. Mm-hmm. However, there's no one in power in Ukraine who's a neo-Nazi. I mean, their president is Jewish. Right. So it's, it wouldn't work out very well.
And one of the first things that Russia bombed was a Holocaust memorial, right?
Right. It did, yes. And what I have found, when you're dealing with disinformation or individuals like Putin and that are very egocentric, they tend to project a lot of who they are into what they're trying to cause people to fear. So I'm not calling Putin a Nazi or anything per se, but he definitely, carries that authoritarian leadership and ego that we do see in those types of aspects as well.
I don't know that people in the United States maybe have an appreciation for how controlled the media is over there. I mean, honestly, I think the amount of disinformation that the United States has had to deal with from Russia has been just absolutely brutal. I can't imagine how bad it is in country.
I've seen it firsthand and in different parts of the Soviet Union, and it is just it's fascinating to just watch it and leave after that, but to not experience it long term. But it is interesting, seeing the comparison in the U.S. because you're dealing with people in Europe have dealt with disinformation for hundreds of years. It's a common thing in their history. So they have a better sense of, how to handle it and how to recognize it than in the United States. We're still very in the infancy of reacting to it. And so there's going to be a lot of obstacles in our way as we try to plow through that and, grow up and mature with that type of disinformation. But it is interesting to see the comparison of how a lot of it there is disinformation, and there just isn't a comparison in the U.S. for that type of exposure.
Russia sort of destroyed its military reputation in the eyes of the world. And I think there's a secondary piece to that, because I think there's two things that I thought were really interesting in all of this. One was Japan and the Kuril Islands just saying, we're done having this argument. These are ours now. And, that's been a long point of contention between Russia and Japan about the islands. And then, and then you hear some of these captured, phone conversations, and even some of the soldiers are talking about, we're worried about China now coming in and invading, right? Because, China has had border conflicts with Russia for a long time in Siberia and Mongolia, and Vladivostok, is kind of claimed by, historically claimed by both countries. Do you think that, this sort of loss of military prestige and sort of depletion of military assets and resources is going to ultimately mean a smaller Russia?
It might. That's definitely a possibility. It's especially most likely on their western flank. It could give countries like Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, maybe even Belarus at some point, strength to stand up and kind of reclaim a lot of their historic lands in those regions. On their eastern side, I don't necessarily know if China would try to make a full invasion at this point, but it is something they might be, considering. I know definitely after this, even if geographically, if Russia stays the same, they're most likely not going to be a major superpower in the world, just because of how their economy is failing, essentially. Their politics are also doing the same, and their military strength is not matching up to what they pronounce it to be. So China could definitely use it to its advantage. I know, most people don't, unless you read Radio Free Europe or other Central Asian news sources, there's sort of a pseudo Cold War going on in Central Asia between Russia and China. So that could be another area of interest there, because Russia does have a lot of influence there, but China is coming in economically with a significant influence that will threaten Russia's border. And that's a way it could gain or increase their sphere of influence and diminish Russia's as well. So it can happen in different ways, just might not be geographically.
The NATO response has actually really changed China's tone on Taiwan, too.
A lot of people, including myself, was assuming China would take advantage of this time and do something with Taiwan. And they were increasing military flights for some time, initially, at the beginning of it, but then they've kind of slowed down a little bit. And I think because they didn't expect the sanctions that the West just sanctioned everybody and everything and everyone that touches Russia. And that would obliterate China, and they don't want that either. And so I think that's why they've kind of stand off, and they'll regroup and probably try something again at some point. But I think right now they're taking a step back and trying to reevaluate their international partnerships.
How much longer do you think that Putin can actually keep up this war?
My guess is this is going to be dragged out for a bit. That at least another 6 months before it's going to be very difficult for Russia they're going to have to make some sort of decision, which for Russia, I know there's been rumors of them utilizing certain types of weapons to kind of speed up the process as well. And they could result in those using that type of drastic action, unfortunately. And that's how you can tell, by the types of weapons and activities that they're using or choosing to use, is how you kind of can guess that timeline of where they're going to, how much longer they're willing to stay or what they're willing to do. And as we've seen, the drastic actions they've taken recently show that the timeline isn't long, unfortunately. But in wartime and conflict, not long is like a year. So that's possible. And I hope,
But some of those weapons have been kind of a bust, too. I mean, their hypersonic missiles haven't lived up to what they had anticipated. And, I mean, they just sunk the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet.
But I will say, Russia still has, an arsenal of chemical components and nuclear components, and those aren't ones we want to have used. But they could utilize them to either gain traction or to speed up that timeline or that process.
Well, I mean, that's the whole thing about this whole conflict is that he's sitting on his nukes, and whether they be like the big nukes or like just gas, that he can use just to like exterminate so many people, I think it's crazy. And that's why like I start to think about like how I can't believe this is still happening in 2022, right? Like I still can't like wrap around my brain. Like how have we not learned? How has the world not learned from all this history? Do you think that like the US should do more? And like, because I know that if we get involved, then it'd be seen as, the US is picking a fight with Russia. But at the same time, I'm just a citizen of the US, but I see what I see and I hear what I hear. To me, it's like, this is past like, oh, you've been really bad, like you shouldn't have done that. It's like, we're past all of that. You know what I mean? It seems like as much as like NATO and stuff has worked and really well, it seems like, these countries around the world came together. It's amazing. But at the same time, it's like, we're still seeing this and we can't do anything, and if it's 6 months from now, what I worry is like the closer we get to that end, he's going to get more desperate and he's going to do crazier things.
Like, I'm of the opinion that, he needs to be stopped, however that looks, because that's the only way this is going to end. Whether that's an internal measure or an external measure or whatnot, that's the only way it's going to actually end. Or the entire Russian military just surrenders, which I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But I will say, like, the one thing that's giving me a little bit of hope during this time is recognizing that yes, there are atrocities beyond words that are occurring. But Ukraine has had a lot of wins, which tells me there's a lot going on behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And that, something like NATO recognizes a world war, like World War III, would not be a good thing. And I think they're doing everything possible to avoid that because, and I've said this on TikTok so many times, of like, one thing we also have to remember is it is absolutely terrible what's going on in Ukraine, but all the leaders that have to make these decisions have millions of people that they have to consider before making that decision. So like Biden has 300 million plus people to consider, and with all different views, and NATO has like collectively millions of people to consider before making these decisions as well, because first and foremost they're responsible for their country, and so that's also a consideration here. Whether or not we agree with it, they have to consider the lives of those people too.
Russia has a history, or the Soviet Union at least had a history of overstating, some of their capabilities. And like, when you look back at, the Bay of Pigs and, the whole Russian missile crisis there, you look at what their actual nuclear capabilities was just a fraction of what the United States had at the time. And that fraction was plagued with so many problems, half of those devices probably wouldn't have even gotten off the ground anyways, right? And at the time we thought that Russia would certainly have parity with the U.S. nuclear capabilities. I wouldn't be surprised if that's a situation, because clearly everything else in their military has been neglected, and you can't just let missiles sit, because they're very complicated pieces of machinery and require a lot of maintenance and service and things like that to make them work. So part of that calculation could be that just, we just really are not going to win that war either, so why fight it, right?
Not calling the bluff of the Russians either. That's not a bluff. I think any of them want to call, at least on the NATO side.
So I cannot encourage people enough to go and watch your TikTok channel, because you just have an absolute ton of content. You're doing collaborations with a lot of people, like you mentioned, Natasha, who's in Russia, and there's other fantastic contributors. Like we were talking earlier about Zena Solo, just is like a treasure trove of information straight from Ukraine and perspective. I think that's the bigger thing, like perspective. You're working so incredibly hard to provide people with information. So I want to just encourage people to go and check that out, because you're doing a great job of it. And I just thank you so much for coming back. And, we might have to follow up again in a little bit, because I'm sure this is a rapidly changing scenario, and it's going to be fascinating to watch in abject horror. But it's, from a political science perspective, it's a really fascinating time we live in. So thank you so much for coming on and just sharing your treasure trove of knowledge. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. I love joining, so I appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. If you like what you saw, give us a like, think about subscribing, and I will see you in the next video.